Well, we're going to do a series of 4 talks on a common theme, and that theme, of course, is the redemption of Israel. And we're going to look at the way in which our God has prepared, is preparing for that day when he will redeem Jacob from the hand of him that is stronger than he. And as a starting point, we're going to have a look at Israel at the time of the end. That is, both what is happening in Israel and how that conforms to the requirements of Bible prophecy. And in the second part of our study tonight, we're going to have a look at Elijah's role, and in doing that, we'll be looking at our own role. So it's going to involve us. So hopefully we'll go away with something in terms of a slightly enhanced vision of the things that you and I hope to do in the work of redeeming Israel in the future. The design of this series of talks is such that if you happen to miss one, they're standalone, so we're not going to have to follow a theme through each of the studies. So this is a standalone talk, and tomorrow night, God willing, we'll be having a look at Jeremiah 30 and 31, Jeremiah's dream, which is all about the redemption of Israel and the second exodus of Israel, based on the life of Jacob. Well, what does Bible prophecy require of Israel at the time of the end? We hope to answer that by looking at a series of passages and looking at what's happening in Israel today and see that they conform to those requirements, or at least they're shaping up that way. But brothers and sisters, young people, friends, why do we take such an interest in Israel? Well, we take that interest because God has that interest. Psalm 121 verse 4 we read, "Behold, he that keepeth Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep." In Zechariah 2 verse 8 we read, "For he that toucheth you, says God, toucheth the apple of his eye." And of course we know that Paul in Romans, in his wonderful treatise on the position of Israel in relation to the purpose of God, says this in Romans 11 verse 28. "As concerning the gospel," he says, "they are enemies for your sakes. But as touching the election, they are beloved for the Father's sakes." And we know that he argues in Romans chapter 11 that Israel has fallen aside for a time. But their redemption, he says, is allied to ours. When Yahweh moves to redeem Israel, we ourselves will be redeemed. And so we are locked together, aren't we, with this people. We cannot share their waywardness, nor does God. We cannot agree with some of their political aims, nor does God. But we are bound to them because of the hope of the promises made unto the fathers. We are inextricably tied to this people. So we have a great interest in them, as God does. And we know from Deuteronomy chapter 11 verse 12 that it says this, that this land is the land which Yahweh thy God careth for. For the eyes of Yahweh thy God are always upon it, from the beginning of the year, even unto the end of the year. So there's not a moment when God is not watching that land and the people in it, sending forth through his Son the angels who will manipulate affairs to bring to pass the things that are required by Bible prophecy. Now the first one of those things that I want to consider tonight is Israel's latter-day prosperity. Let's turn to that very well-known passage, Ezekiel chapter 38. Ezekiel 38, of course, sets out very plainly the status of Israel just prior to Armageddon. Now, most of you will be aware that Israel, since it became a nation state on the 14th of May 1948, has been ruled by prime ministers who, for the most part, have been socialists. Or if they were right-wingers, they were not economists or managers. And so Israel's economy for 50 or 60 years has been a basket case. But all of that's changed. And it's changed in the last 15 years. And I'll tell you how that changed and what God did to achieve that change. So here was Israel bumping along with a socialist government, for the most part, who had really no idea how to organise an economy. And of course, that's why Israel was not particularly prosperous for the first 50 years or so of its history. But Ezekiel 38 verse 12 makes it very plain, doesn't it? How Israel has to be found when Gog comes from the north. They think an evil thought. And in verse 12 we read that this is their thought: to take a spoil and to take a prey, to turn thine hand upon the desolate places that are now inhabited, and upon the people that are gathered out of the nations, which have gotten cattle and goods, that dwell in the midst of the land. So this prophecy requires that Israel be very prosperous just prior to Armageddon. And that's the way things are shaping up. In the mid-90s, a man called Benjamin Netanyahu, an American educated MBA, became Prime Minister for a couple of years from 1996 to 1998. Of course, he's currently the Prime Minister of Israel as well. But it was in that period of 96 to 98 that Netanyahu made some decisions that have shaped Israel's economic position today. He reformed Israel's financial system completely, and that has produced their current prosperity. Now, most of us, of course, are aware of the global financial crisis of 2008. Some of us are still suffering from it. Australia and Canada came out of it, amongst the Western nations, better than most. Why? Canada has strong banking and financial regulations in place, and so does Australia. Other countries who suffered didn't have those regulations in place. Now that's what Israel's got. They've got very strong financial frameworks in place because of Netanyahu. So God put him there for a purpose. But he had a very shaky prime ministership, but he was there long enough to get that in place. And that is why Israel is prosperous today. Israel has the highest ratio of university degrees, produces more scientific papers, and has the highest number of scientists and technicians per capita of any nation in the world. Israel leads the world in technology development, and because of that it has very strong ties with India, and most of you are aware, because you get phone calls from India, you are aware that India is in the vanguard of technology and its development today. So Israel have got very, very close ties with India for that reason. Israel has the largest number of companies on the Nasdaq stock exchange outside of North America. Israel hosts the world's largest wholesale diamond centre and handles most of the cutting and polishing of diamonds in the world. And just as one last example, because we could go on all night about Israel's prosperity and its position in the economic world, but just one instance that to me illustrates the ability of this people to make money. An Israeli company has produced a bionic retina implant, restoring sight to many who have lost their vision. To be sure, it's in black and white, but they'll eventually develop colour, a little bit like black and white television became colour television in the end. They've actually got this implant that they can put in someone's eyes, totally blind, and they can see in black and white. Obviously, the Jews. Most of the inventions that have shaped our world, including, of course, the movie world, have been from Jews. So here is a people who know how to make money, and that's what Israel is doing today. However, their prosperity stands over against another prophecy, and we'll look at this in more detail tomorrow, and that's Jeremiah chapter 30. Please come along to Jeremiah 30 and have a brief look at verses 13 and 14. We get a chance in this series. I want to talk about the impending financial collapse that the world is talking about. It's coming, a huge one, another massive depression. They know it's going to happen. And I can show you hours worth of TV programs that have been downloaded by people who have an interest in these things, which demonstrate that there is coming very soon another massive financial collapse that will make the global financial crisis of 2008 look like a Sunday school picnic. We're not going to be here to see that, brothers and sisters. I'm confident of that, because we have to be taken away in times of prosperity, and prosperity is shortly going to disappear from the earth for at least 10, 15 years. And you usually only get out of those sorts of depressions with a war. And that's how they're talking. We might just show a few of these clips in one of our final studies, just to demonstrate that it's coming. You know what? When that crash comes, Israel is going to stay, relatively speaking, on top of it. They have, of course, found massive quantities of oil and gas recently. I wonder why it took them this long to find it. Because God wanted them to find it now. And they will be independent in terms of their fuel and gas supplies. So there's a nation that is going to come through this crisis. It is looming upon the world much better than most other peoples. Bible prophecy requires that. And it also requires that they be an object of desire for Gog in the north. And they will be that, but they won't have too many friends. Jeremiah chapter 30, verses 13 and 14, we read this of Israel: there is none to plead thy cause. Why? Well, their bruise is incurable, verse 12. That thou mayest be bound up. Thou hast no healing medicines. All thy lovers have forgotten thee. They seek thee not. Why? For I have wounded thee with the wound of an enemy, with the chastisement of a cruel one, with a multitude of thy iniquity, because thy sins were increased. So we know, and this prophecy, as we will see tomorrow night, God willing, is about our time and the time to come. It's the time of Jacob's trouble, time of Armageddon and beyond, when Jacob is redeemed from the hand of him that is stronger than he. That's the time. Just prior to that time, Israel has to lose its friends. Now, it has a few friends, doesn't it? Still. But look at the history. Of the 175 United Nations Security Council and the 690 General Assembly resolutions passed before 1990, so this is 20 years ago, this is not the record of the last 20 years, 97 of the 175 and 429 of the 690 were directed against Israel. Now that's not bad proportion, is it? The United Nations would be out of business if it wasn't for the motions being put up against Israel. So they haven't got too many friends. And both the US and Britain in recent months have shifted their attitude towards Israel considerably. So there are signs that the friendship that the United States has for Israel is fading away. And so it will be, because Bible prophecy requires that at the time of the end, Israel will be isolated. That's not going to bother them too much, because they'll be independent, they'll be prosperous, they'll have their own oil and gas, they'll have one of the best economies in the world. Who cares whether the US doesn't send their billions of dollars anymore? So they'll be arrogant for that reason. One of their close allies, Turkey, as you are aware, because of the Gaza fiasco, when 9 people were killed when the Israelis dropped men onto the ships, or the ships that were coming into the Gaza Strip. Turkey led action to boycott Israel over that fiasco. So there's a lot of things happening that will bring about the isolation of Israel from all of those who have previously supported it. And it may well be, just may well be, that one of the reasons why Israel will be caught off guard by Gog is that they might cuddle up to Russia a bit more. There's already moves underway in that direction. What about Christianity and Israel? Well, historically we know, of course, the Catholic Church has a long history of hatred and of murder of the Jews. Methodists and Presbyterians are unquestionably the most aggressively anti-Israeli among liberal Protestant denominations. The Episcopalians, and we don't have those in Australia, they're an American version. The Episcopalians The Evangelical Lutherans and United Church of Christ have debated and in some cases have adopted strong policies intended to bring direct or indirect economic pressure on Israel to compromise with the Palestinians. And one of those things is that they tell their members not to buy shares in Jewish companies. Don't touch Jewish companies. So the churches have made their position quite clear. Now, what do we expect then? If Israel's going to be prosperous, if they're isolated from their friends but thumb their noses at them, if they've got the Christian and the Muslim world against them, what do you think Israel's attitude's going to be just prior to Armageddon? Can we expect that there's going to be some kind of reformation amongst the Jews in Israel? Is that what the Bible teaches? That we can look and expect that there's going to be a lot of Jews who will reform themselves and turn back to their God in a way that He would accept? Can we expect that? I want you to come to Ezekiel 39. Let's see what the Bible has to say about this matter. And what you can see on the screen behind me is the problem of the latter days. I want you to notice the language that is used here. Ezekiel 39, of course, is primarily post-Armageddon. It covers the 40-year period from Armageddon to the end of the second exodus of Israel and the subjugation of all the nations. So that's the subject matter from verse 17 onwards, where God invites the submitted nations to come and share in the sacrifice that He's going to make. That's the sacrifice of Revelation chapter 19, but that's another subject. What I want to see from this context is what we can expect of the character of God's people Israel right at the end of the days. Well, this is it. Verse 24. This is what God says. Maybe just step back to verse 23. And the nations shall know that the house of Israel went into captivity for their iniquity, because they trespassed against me. Therefore I hid my face from them. If you're into highlighting in your Bible, and I guess there's some young people who don't mind doing a bit of that, there's a phrase here you can highlight. It sticks out for the record. It's this phrase in verse 24, therefore I hid my face from them. It comes out again, as we're going to see in verse 23 and then verse 24, and again in verse 29. Verse 24 says, according to their uncleanness and according to their transgressions have I done unto them, and hid my face from them. So that's twice already. Therefore, look at this verse, verse 25. Therefore thus saith Adonai Yahweh, now will I bring again the captivity of Jacob. He's talking about the second exodus of Israel under Elijah, and we'll talk about that in a moment, God willing. And have mercy upon the whole house of Israel. In other words, this is the Jews in the land at the return of Christ, and the Jews who are outside the land at the return of Christ. The whole house of Israel. And will be jealous for my holy name. After that they have borne their shame and all their trespasses whereby they have trespassed against me, when they dwelt safely in their land, and none made them afraid. So when's this, brothers and sisters? What time period is God saying that His people Israel upset Him the most? Well, He talks about their long history of waywardness. And He can go back centuries, millennia. These people have turned their back upon Him time after time. All of that history. But what is the period when God says that they upset Him most? Well, He says it here, verse 26. When He gives you the time. When they dwelt safely in their land, and none made them afraid. That's a quotation, isn't it? That's a quotation from Ezekiel 38, verse 8 and 11. The time just prior to Armageddon. The time between our removal to the judgment seat and Armageddon. We won't see this from here. There'll be a 10-year period between our removal for judgment from the resurrection time to Armageddon. And it's in that period that Ezekiel 38 will see its fulfilment and peace will finally come to that land. There'll be no walls and bars and gates. I've been through a few of those in the last 12 months. Spent hours in Israeli security places, locked up. So I know a little bit about Israeli security. I've stood and looked up at the 8-metre high wall. I mean, it's removable with a crane. And Ezekiel 38 says that they will have no walls, bars and gates, verse 11, because they will be at peace. End of verse 8. They shall dwell safely, all of them. Verse 11. I will go to them that are at rest, says God, that dwell safely or securely. All of them, dwelling without walls and having neither bars nor gates. Now that doesn't exist today. That's still got to happen before Armageddon. And when Israel becomes prosperous, and when the world goes into a deep depression, nobody's going to have any money to fight. The Europeans won't send money to the Palestinians anymore. And the Palestinians will have to make peace with Israel just to survive. And I've been through the West Bank recently, and they want, most of them, want peace. You know why? They've got these big widescreen televisions on their walls. I've seen some houses on the West Bank that would make your richest suburbs in Vancouver look like Poverty Street. There's unbelievable amounts of money going in there. They don't want trouble with Israel anymore. How can you watch your television when you're fighting? So there's a spirit amongst the Palestinians to make peace with Israel. You heard any troubles in the West Bank in the last 2 years? Heard on the news? No. That's why. That day's coming. And when the financial crisis hits and the world's economy goes over the precipice, it's going to change a lot of things overnight. And one of those things will be peace, just like Ezekiel 38 requires. You know what God says? That when that happens, from then to the time he sends Elijah is the time when his people Israel upset him the most. For all their history, that's the period when they get under God's skin, if I can use that terminology. When they dwelt safely in the land and none made them afraid. So don't expect reformations in Israel. Expect prosperity. Expect Israel to be isolated, but at the same time arrogant. Arrogant to the point that God isolates that one period in their history. Is the one that troubled him the most. Scripture's pretty clear, isn't it? Israel's latter-day arrogance is spelled out. And their long history of pride and self-dependence peaks in these latter days. As I said, recent massive finds of oil and gas will make Israel self-sufficient for decades to come. And they attribute their success to their own abilities, don't they? Their ingenuity, their endurance under duress and trial and oppression and attack from enemies. They say, well, this is because of our arm that we've done this. And of course, many of the older generation of Israel, the Holocaust generation, and those who immediately succeeded them, ceased to believe in God anyway. You've heard the stories, haven't you, of the Jews in their concentration camps who pleaded with God, just as Deuteronomy 28 said they would. Would God that were morning. And when the morning came, would God that were evening. And they cried out, surely the God of Israel will answer our prayers. They didn't get an answer, not the answer they were looking for, not deliverance. And so many of them said, there is no God. There cannot be a God. So many Jews are atheists for that reason. Over 2/3 of them are secular, don't believe in God. And that's why some of the behaviour that we see, not only in the land, but elsewhere where Jews are concentrated, is not particularly salubrious. Because God is not in the picture. So this is the character of God's nation just prior to Armageddon. And these are some of the reasons for it. You know, one of the things that must really upset God is that the nation of Israel today claims to be its own Messiah. Now, this is not difficult, is it, for a people who could say, in the presence of Pilate, we have no king but Caesar, completely repudiating the covenant made to David. They're doing a similar thing today, inasmuch as they say that the nation itself is its own Messiah. Now, some of you might have seen some of these quotes before. If you've not read the book Bible and Sword by the Jewish historian Barbara Tuchman, who died a few years ago, you should try and get hold of it. It is an absolutely wonderful piece of literature about the history of Israel, particularly their relationship with the British Empire and the way the British have supported them to return to their land. Tuchman, amongst other things, says this: not until they came to perceive, beginning in the 1860s, that they would have to act as their own Messiah, did the return to Israel actually become realisable. Heinrich Graetz, in 1864, so this is going back to Brother Thomas's time, wrote this: the Jewish people must be their own Messiah. And a tour of the land by Christadelphians, on which my uncle was present, in the 1970s. When they were in Jerusalem, they asked the chief rabbi of Jerusalem, Rabbi Abrahams, are you in expectation of the Messiah? His response was, we are the Messiah. We, the Jewish people, the nation of Israel, is the Messiah. Now that we count that as ludicrous, don't we? But they don't. They believe it. And God knew it would happen. I want to show you the scriptures where that is spelled out. He knew that would happen. So he's made provision for it. He's going to bring them to their knees because they claim to be the Messiah. Because you see, there was a king in the history of the nation of Judah who thought he was the Messiah. His name was Uzziah, otherwise known as Azariah. Come to 2 Chronicles chapter 26 and let's have a look at a bit of the history of this king. Now we know this story pretty well. Here is a teenager who comes to the throne, 16 years of age, and immediately sets in motion the wheels of development and prosperity. He takes Elath as a 16-year-old. And then there is a long succession over 40 years of incredible achievements right across the spectrum, whether it be agriculture, military, you name it. He achieved. And God was with him in that achievement. Spelt that out several times in this record. He was marvellously helped, the record says, till he was strong. The problem was it went to his head. And he began to ask himself the question, when Messiah cometh, will he do greater works than this man? His answer was no. But he had one problem. He was sitting upon the throne of David, but he wasn't a priest. He certainly wasn't the high priest. But conveniently, the high priest's name was Azariah, and that was Uzziah's other name, Azariah. So all he needed to do was to change the person, not the name, and become king and priest. And we know what happened. He chose a special feast day, he took a censer, he went into the temple. Josephus says that there was an earthquake, and there was an earthquake in the days of Uzziah, wasn't there? We'll look at that in a moment. There was an earthquake, split the temple, a ray of light shot through, lit up the fact that his forehead was now full of leprosy. And he left that place crying out, unclean, unclean, chased out by 80 priests. That's the story. And he dwelt in a house apart. And the record there in verse 21 of 2 Chronicles 26 says this: Uzziah the king was a leper unto the day of his death, and dwelt in a several house. Now Rotherham translates that, a house apart. Just store that one away on a shelf somewhere. A house apart as a leper because of his presumption in trying to assume the role of Messiah. Uzziah is the would-be Messiah. And that's what God does to him. Now, who is he a type of? He could have been a magnificent type of Christ. His achievements were unbelievable. Could have been a wonderful type of Christ. He ends up being a type of modern Israel. So let's just review some of his achievements. As I said, he captured and built Elath as a trade city. One of the first things that Israel did. They made Elath a trading port. Second thing he did, he captured the Shephelah and the Negev. It's one of the first things that Israel did as a nation. The War of Independence and the War of 1956. He defeated the Arabs and the Jordanians in battle. Israel's done that 4 times. He fortified Jerusalem against attack. Did you know in the 1970s that every building in Jerusalem had to be built to withstand nuclear warfare? Won't help them when the big earthquake comes. But that's what they did. He built a prosperous agricultural society. You eat oranges from Israel, so you know about their agricultural prosperity. And if you do get a chance to water your gardens in the summertime, most of you will be using that black plastic material, drip feeding, all right? Guess where that was invented? In Israel. And they made the desert blossom as a rose with their ingenuity. That's exactly what Isaiah did. Provided water supplies for the desert, just like the Jews had done. He developed a powerful army of 300,000 men. Guess what number the standing army of Israel is? 300,000. He becomes a leader in missile warfare. Did you notice that? Verse 15 of 2 Chronicles 26. He made in Jerusalem engines invented by cunning men to be on the towers and upon the bulwarks to shoot arrows and great stones withal. In other words, he was in the forefront of missile warfare. And in the 1970s and 80s, when the Jews took possession of planes supplied by the Americans, guess what they did? They took off the American missiles and put their own on. They were far superior. And they proved that in 1967 with their laser guided or some guidance system in the bombs. And they cleaned up the Egyptian Air Force in a matter of hours. Leaders in missile warfare. And Isaiah was helped by God. We read that in verse 7, in verse 8, and in verse 15. He's unquestionably helped by God. And all of this success for 40 years. How long you had success for? 2 or 3 years? 10 years? Goes to your head sometimes, doesn't it? 40 years. Unmitigated success went to his head. He began to think, I'm Messiah. I'm a son of David. I'm Messiah. Look at these achievements. Only lack one thing. The high priesthood. So I'll take it. And that's where he came unstuck. He attributed his success, like Israel does, to their own strength. That is their problem. So Israel claims today to be the Messiah. The nation itself is the Messiah. So what did God do to Uzziah, this presumptuous king? Well, he smote him with leprosy at the time of an earthquake. The earthquake you read of in Amos chapter 1 verse 1. Amos prophesied 2 years before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah. That's how critical that was. You know, they'll talk, historically, if they get time to do it, they'll talk about the 2010 floods in Brisbane. Who cares anyway? But you see, because it's a dramatic event. 9/11, what year was that? Come on, what year was 9/11?
2001.
Of course. You don't forget that, do you? What year was President Kennedy shot? 63. Yeah, exactly. So you know those dates. All these young people knew them as well, didn't they? Yeah. See, that's how mankind thinks, isn't it? These significant dates. And Israel claims to be Messiah because they think that all of their achievements from 1948 onwards are due to them. It's going to be quite different when Zechariah 14 happens. I want you to come to Zechariah chapter 14. Now again, you've considered this in great detail in this ecclesia, so you know this prophecy very well. It talks about the humbling of Israel by an earthquake. But I wonder why it says this in verse 5. He shall flee from the valley of the mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach very near. Yea, ye shall flee like as ye fled in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. Yahweh my God shall come, and all the holy ones with thee. So the saints are there. So part of your work, brothers and sisters, part of your work in the company of our Lord Jesus Christ, in the very near future, probably only 10 or 11 years away, if Christ comes when I think he'll come, is to humble God's people in the land who think they are the Messiah. And the great earthquake described in Zechariah chapter 14 is likened to the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. I wonder why. Same problem. Pride, arrogance, presumption, claiming to be the Messiah, just like their king of old. So that's why when you turn back to Zechariah 12, you read this. Zechariah 12 verses 12 to 14. Post great earthquake, 2/3 in the land destroyed. Verse 12 says this, and the land shall mourn, every family apart. The family of the house of David apart. And so it goes on like that. Have you counted these up, Nathan? The Hebrew word apart? If you haven't, nobody else in the room has. You know how many there are there? 11. Anyone know what the number 11 stands for in the Bible? Failure. So here God is telling us very plainly, isn't it? He's exposed the failure of his people. And they, like their king Uzziah, because of leprosy, will dwell in houses apart until they come to a full realisation of the depth of their apostasy and their need for recovery. And that recovery comes in chapter 13 of Zechariah. Verse 1. In that day there shall be a fountain open to the house of David and to the inhabitants of Jerusalem for sin and for uncleanness. The margin has separation for uncleanness. So what kind of separation do you think he might be talking about here? Well, when you were cleansed, if you were ever cleansed of leprosy, the first thing you did was to wash your body in water. You need a fountain for that. So he's unquestionably talking about the uncleanness of leprosy. So like their king Uzziah, who was smitten in the forehead. Forehead, why? Because that's where your brain box is. That's what was corrupted. Their thinking. Smitten in the forehead with leprosy. Corrupt thinking. They live in houses apart until the realisation dawns upon them they need to change their ways. And a fountain for uncleanness is provided for them. So when you look at Zechariah 14, you're actually looking at the way God has set all of this up to humble his people, as he humbled Uzziah, king of Judah, who thought he, like Israel, was the Messiah. So the earthquake is going to have, of course, devastating impacts upon all of their works. Fault line runs through there. Half of the mountain goes towards the north, half towards the south, as we are quite familiar. And they will flee, like as they fled in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. Well, that's all I'm going to say about Israel today. I think we can see from just those few considerations what Bible prophecy requires. And I think we can also see that it's actually shaping up that way. So we must be close, and we are close. What I want to do now is to step into the next phase of this talk, and to talk about the redemption of this people and the work of Elijah, which is why we read Malachi chapter 4. So let's come back to Malachi 4. We're going to focus mainly on the last 3 verses. You're fully aware, of course, that verses 1 through 3 are about Armageddon and our involvement in it. We are the calves of the stall who go gambling. And I don't mean by that down at the casino in North Battleford. I'm not talking about G-A-M-B-L-I-N-G, gambling, but gambling. That is G-A-M-B-O-L. So when you let, as you do in Canada, you let your animals out of the barn after the winter when they've been locked up for 3 or 4 months, what do? Do they just toddle out the field and say, there's some nice grass out here? Or they get out there and they bounce around like children? Well, that's what that's talking about. When we're released from the problem of mortality, brothers and sisters, and given the role of establishing the kingdom of God alongside of our Lord Jesus Christ, we'll be bouncing around as immortals will, in happiness and joy and enthusiasm and vigour to achieve the work that will be given to it. That's what that section of Scripture is about. And part of that work is then explained in verses 5 and 6. It's the work of Elijah the prophet. But he won't be alone, as you'll see in a moment. He's going to have others with him who will share that work. You know, there's something very fundamental here, and some of you will have heard me say this before, but I deliberately repeat this because I have to say, and I say this in humility, this is not as well understood in our brotherhood as it ought to be. We need to get this right. There are ways in which God describes Israel, his people, in the Scripture, in the prophetic Scriptures. He uses these terms of the Jews who are outside the land. When you read in the prophetic Scriptures where the people, not the land, are the subject, because we know, of course, in Ezekiel 38 it speaks about the mountains of Israel. They called the state Israel. We as a community rejoiced because it was named Israel in terms of Ezekiel 38. But God doesn't call the people in the land Israel. He never calls them Israel prior to Armageddon. They're always Judah. So whenever you read in the prophetic Scriptures, so listen to carefully to what I'm saying, in the prophetic Scriptures which speak about our time, the return of Christ, the events of Armageddon, whenever you read these names, Israel, Ephraim and the remnant of Jacob, it always refers to the Jews who are outside the land at the return of Christ. When you read the name Judah, it always refers to the Jews who are inside the land at the return of Christ. I've been checking it as I've done my readings for the last 30 years. But I ask you to do the same. Check the context. And it's invariable. There's only one where there may be an issue of doubt, and that's in Isaiah 11. And that's not a problem either. Check it when you do your readings. And we read a lot about the prophets, don't we? Check the name. Look at the context, and you will see it is absolutely pristine. It's invariable. So if you don't apply this formula, you will not interpret prophetic Scriptures correctly. Sadly, when I read some of the stuff that's going around our brotherhood, that is the case. It's not interpreted correctly. Mistakes are made because this formula is not applied. So I raised that because I think it is vital, it's critical. Just a couple of proofs, just so that you can be satisfied that this is the way it's presented. I won't ask you to turn these up, but you can do so if you wish. Joel chapter 3 verse 1. For behold, in those days and in that time, what time? Well, he gives us 2 eras, pretty close together. When I shall bring again the captivity of Judah. What does he mean? 1948. The people who come back to the land, form a nation state called Israel. God says the people are Judah. What about the captivity of Jerusalem? Well, we know that, don't we? 1967. So you've got your 2 dates, 1948 and 1967. Zechariah 12 verse 7. Yahweh shall also save the tents of Judah first, because they're the Jews in the land. And we'll come perhaps back to this one a little later on. Jeremiah chapter 3 verse 18, Rotherham's translation. It's very important in the scheme of things. In those days shall the house of Judah go unto the house of Israel. Now, where is the house of Israel? Well, we read on. That they may enter together out of the land of the north. So Israel is in the north. They're not in the land. It's Judah who's in the land. And they're the ones who will be purified by the work of Christ. Okay? Now, it doesn't matter that the Jews in the land come from all the tribes. That's not important in this. When God looks down upon those people, he knows which tribe they come from, and he'll put them in the cantons or divisions of the land after Armageddon. He knows that. He just looks at it and says, that is Judah, the Jews in the land. And we'll see the perfect consistency of that over the next couple of nights, God willing. Let's have a look then at the work of Elijah. Malachi 4, 5 and 6. We need to step back though to verse 4 briefly. Remember ye the law of Moses, he says, my servant, which I commanded unto him in Horeb, for who? All Israel. What does that mean? Israel and Judah. It's a comprehensive term. All Israel. So what does that mean? It means that what follows, the work of Elijah, must apply to Judah and to Israel. To the whole house of Israel. Verse 5. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of Yahweh, and he shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse. Now, there's been discussion about this term before. It's pointed out, of course, that that's the word pani, and pani means the face, and therefore some suggest that Elijah's work is done in the face of the day of Yahweh. And the day of Yahweh, we know, is not just one day, it's a period of 40 years. Well, yes, with a stretch, you might be able to make that work. But normally, pani simply means before. You can find that word in Malachi 3 verse 1. Have a look at Malachi 3, page back. It says this. Behold, I will send my messenger, and he shall prepare thy way before me. Before me? Yes. Before, in terms of time. It's talking about the work, John the Baptist, right, and the work of Elijah in relation to Christ. So it's before the appearance of Messiah. Amos chapter 1 verse 1, 2 years before the earthquake. What does that mean? Simply before. So in terms of time, the work of Elijah begins before the great day of Yahweh, Armageddon. I believe 3.5 years before, just like John the Baptist's work began, before Christ made his appearance on the scene. Now, we don't have to argue about this because the scripture speaks eloquently about it. This passage is quoted in Luke chapter 1 and verse 17. And it's quoted in relation to John the Baptist. When did he begin his work? Across the face of Christ's mission? Or before Christ came on the scene? Pretty obvious, isn't it? Now, notice what Brother Thomas says in his translation of this passage in Luke 1. To restore to the posterity the father's dispositions and disobedient ones to just persons' mode of thinking. And that's what is meant by this phraseology here. That the work of Elijah primarily is to turn the heart of the fathers to the children. Now, if I'd been writing that, I wouldn't have put that in. What I would have put in there was this. To turn the heart of the children to their fathers, wouldn't you? He doesn't put that first. Why does he put it first? Why does he put this turning the heart of the fathers? He means Abraham, Isaac and Jacob to the children. Well, Isaiah 29 verses 22 and 23 explain it. Therefore thus saith Yahweh, who redeemed Abraham concerning the house of Jacob, Jacob shall not now be ashamed, neither shall his face now wax pale. And Jacob's as dead as a doornail, isn't he? You don't know anything. But if Jacob was alive, he would be ashen-faced, knowing the behaviour of those who came from his loins. He would be utterly ashamed of them. That's what that's saying. And so the work of Elijah is to restore the fathers to their children, which you can only do by turning the children back to the disposition of the fathers. Okay? So it's a very, very important work. We're going to see John the Baptist began that work. Now there are two phases to Elijah's work, and we saw that by looking at verse 4. He has a work in relation to Judah, and he has a work in relation to Israel. As I said, his message was to all Israel. And John the Baptist was Elijah to Judah, to the Jews in the land. So that when Elijah actually comes, he's been raised along with all those who are responsible, immortalised together with those who are accepted, and he goes forth in the company of many saints to accomplish this work. When that happens, brethren and sisters, his work will be confined to the Jews outside the land. Because Elijah's work to the Jews inside the land was accomplished by John the Baptist. Now some are slow to pick this up, and they were in Christ's day too, because he said that. Matthew 11 verses 13 to 15. For all the prophets and the law, he says, were unto John when he prophesied, and this is Robert Hand's translation, and if ye are willing to accept it, and they had trouble, he, that is, John, is Elijah, the one destined to come. Straight over their heads. They had no idea. That's in Matthew chapter 11. So guess what? In Matthew 17, Christ tries again. They get through the first time, you try the second time. Matthew 17, 10 to 13. And his disciples asked him, saying, Why then say the scribes that Elijah must first come? They knew the prophecy of Malachi 4. And Jesus answered and said unto them, Elijah truly shall first come and restore all things. Yes, he's got a work to do before I arrive publicly on the scene. But I say unto you that Elijah is come already. To whom? To the Jews in the land at the time of Christ. He's come already, and they knew him not, but have done unto him whatsoever they listed. And then finally a penny dropped. And they said, Oh, he's talking about John the Baptist. Yeah, he was. Then the disciples understood that he spake unto them of John the Baptist. So don't expect Elijah to go into the land called Israel, to the people known as Judah. That work's done. It's done. Christ will deal with them, and that's what Zechariah's about. Elijah's work is to those who haven't seen him yet in any form. You know, they leave a chair at the end of the table vacant for Elijah. One day he's going to come and sit in it, and they'll be very surprised, even though they leave the chair vacant. He's going to come to the Jews who are outside the land. And that will all happen, of course, because of the work of the resurrection, the judgment seat, and the immortalisation of the faithful. When Elijah and those who go forth with him are prepared, they will be sent out to the Jews outside the land, all parts of the earth, to begin this work of redeeming, restoring God's people. It's a work, of course, that will take 40 years. The second Exodus starts here at the beginning of Elijah's mission, prior to Armageddon. Here you've got on the left-hand side of the screen the return of Christ, the resurrection of the dead, the judgment seat, the marriage of the Lamb, the preparation of the saints. Armageddon is this line here, 10 years after our removal. Elijah's work begins some-time prior to that. Goes on, the second Exodus goes on for 40 years. And it's used, of course, in which this is our studies in the coming nights, God willing. We're going to have a look at the way in which the second Exodus of Israel is used by God to bring judgments upon the Catholic nations of Europe who will support the papacy against Christ. We're going to have a look at that, God willing, tomorrow evening in part, and then later on next week. I'm not going to go into the details of that because I want to move on very quickly. Matthew 24. I want to talk about our role in this now. Business. One thing to talk about the mechanics of it, another thing to talk about participation. And that's what we're waiting for. Participation in these things. And here we have the Lord's Olivet prophecy. In verse 28, we have, of course, the verse that terminates the matter that deals with AD 70. In verse 29, we have a bridging verse. We know this from Luke 21, the way it's used there. Suddenly, after the tribulation of those days, shall the sun and the moon and the stars will not give light. They'll fall from heaven, that is from government. You know, those are symbols of political powers, ecclesiastical powers, notable people. That's what happened in AD 70. But you see, Christ doesn't just have AD 70 in mind. In Luke 21, those same words are used. The powers of the heavens shall be shaken. He bridges 2,000 years in a word. He brings us down to our day. So we know that this is a prophecy about our times. The powers of the heavens shall be shaken. There's the bridge. It's pretty quick, I know, but I don't have time to go into the detail. I want to get down into the meat of this prophecy about Elijah. And it's here. And he says, and then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Now you must establish who he's talking about in verse 30 if you want to understand verse 31. You can't understand verse 31 without establishing what verse 30 is saying. So who are these clouds of heaven? What is this coming? What's the sign of the Son of Man in heaven? We don't have to argue about that either, because we have a scriptural passage from the words of Christ himself through John as to what that is. It's actually Armageddon. Now if you want to check this out, have a look at Revelation chapter 1 verse 7. This is what it says. Behold, he cometh with clouds. Language? Clouds. Clouds of heaven. And every eye shall see him. And they also which pierced him, the Jews. And all kindreds of the earth shall wail because of him. And then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn. And they shall see the Son of Man coming. Got it? It's identical. And what Christ is saying in Revelation chapter 1 verse 7 is unmistakable. The previous verse he's talking about kings and priests. We've been made kings and priests. So who are the clouds? The symbol of a multitude, a glorified multitude with Christ. So the judgment seat's passed. Verse 30 of Matthew 24, the judgment's passed. And we're part of a glorified multitude who go forth with Christ. And that word coming there is the Greek word erchomai. And erchomai means to move from one place to another. It's a reference to the march of the rainbowed angel. So the clouds of heaven here is a reference to you and me in glory, brethren and sisters. And what are we going forth for? Well, there's the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. That's Armageddon. That's the work of redeeming the Jews in the land. The third who survived. What about the Jews outside the land? That's verse 31. Verse 31 says this. And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet. And they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heaven to the other. Now we normally hear this used in relation to the saints, don't we? The angels going out and gathering the judgment. How can that be the case? Verse 30, they're already glorified. So what's this talking about? It's talking about the role of the saints in relation to Israel, God's elect nation. Now that word angels, of course, we know as angelos or angelos, as pronounced in the Greek. He shall send his angels, his messengers. These messengers are the saints, led by Elijah the prophet in fulfilment of Malachi chapter 4 verse 5. And they go with a great sound of a trumpet. You can find in Isaiah 18 verse 3, 27:13, Zechariah 9:40 and other places reference to the trumpet being used to call Israel home. His elect, scattered Israel is called in Isaiah 45:4, 65:15 and Deuteronomy 30 and places like that, God's elect. But most importantly, brethren and sisters, if you can just keep a hand in Matthew 24, just flick back to Zechariah chapter 2 verse 6. Here is the coup de grace. This is the proof, beyond all dispute, that Christ meant that verse 31 is about the work of Elijah. and the regathering of scattered Israel. Look at the language. Zechariah chapter 2 and verse 6. This is usually well read at Christmas time, isn't it? Ho, ho. Well, it's a call. Come forth and flee from the land of the north. So where are these Jews? In the land of the north. For I have spread you abroad as the four winds of the heaven. The exact phrase of Matthew 24, verse 31. He will gather together his elect nation Israel from the four winds, from the one end of the heaven to the other. Now, you can't mistake that, can you? Christ is deliberately choosing the language of the Old Testament to demonstrate what he means here. If anybody's got any doubts about that, you just read the next verse in Matthew 24. Now learn the parable of the fig tree. What's that about? It's final proof, isn't it? It's not about the saints. This is about the redemption of Israel. The saints are the ones who are going to be involved in that. You know, I know some Christadelphians have spent a lifetime in a love affair with Israel. They go there frequently, they devote their life to making money for youth and do all sorts of things. They love Israel, and so we should. We might not do all of those things, but we love Israel. And guess what reward God's going to give to those who love Israel? Go out with Elijah and bring him home. That's the reward he's going to give him. Go out and bring him home. What a work that will be. I'm going to move on very quickly, because he goes on to say in the next verse, so likewise ye, when ye shall see all these things, know that it, time of summer, time of harvest, harvest of the earth, Armageddon, heap of sheaves in a valley, the judgment, that's the language, so we know where we are. Now Elijah has a message to Israel, and that message is back here in Jeremiah 3. I want you to come back to Jeremiah 3, because I want to just nail down that formula that we used a little earlier. Jeremiah 3, you read this. Verse 12. Verses 12 to 15 inclusive is Elijah's message to scattered Israel. Now who's he talking about in this chapter? Have a look at verse 7. And I said after she had done all these things, turn thou unto me, but she returned not. And her treacherous sister Judah saw it. So there's the southern kingdom Judah. And I saw when, for all the causes whereby backsliding Israel committed adultery, I put her away. I gave her a bill of divorce. I sent the Assyrians in 722 BC, and they took her out of my house. That's what a bill of divorce meant. It didn't mean you go and remarry, because God didn't remarry. Verse 14 tells us that. He says to these people he put out of his house, I am married unto you. 2,730 years later. Still married to Israel. So when Elijah goes out, who's he going to talk to? God's been talking in verses 7 to 10 and 11 about Judah and Israel. Judah, southern kingdom, Israel, the northern kingdom. Elijah's message comes in 12 to 15. Who's it to? Verse 12. Go and proclaim these words towards the north. Are they in the land? No. They're in the land of the north. So what does he call them? If they're not in the land, and they're in the land of the north, what are they called? Backsliding Israel. It's just one of many, many examples where it is absolutely pristine in its consistency. Elijah's mission is to the Jews outside the land. And some of these Jews in the land become ambassadors to their scattered brethren. Remember that quotation we made from verse 18 a bit earlier? In those days, the house of Judah, this is post-establishment of the throne of David in verse 17, in those days the house of Judah shall walk with the house of Israel. Rotherham's translation is better. In those days shall the house of Judah, go unto the house of Israel. That is after Armageddon, when they have themselves been redeemed. So Yahweh makes his appeal to scatter Israel through Elijah. It's based on their past history as a nation, as his wife, whom he had to put out of his house because of adultery. And they are humbled by the events of Armageddon, and they respond to him in the latter verses of this chapter, and then he lays out in chapter 4 the terms of their restitution. They must recognise him as the only true God. They must abandon all abominations and confess their sin. They must swear, it says in verse 2 of chapter 4, that Yahweh is the epitome of truth, judgment and righteousness, and was just in punishing them. And they must become an example for all nations. Now, I was going to talk about Zechariah 9 verse 13, but I think our time has escaped me. I'm just going to put it up on the screen without going into great explanations. And we'll come back to this because it's part of a subsequent study. Zechariah 9:13 talks about God using both the house of Judah and the house of Israel as a bow and arrow, in that order. He says in that prophecy, when I have bent my bow of Judah for me and filled the bow with the arrow of Ephraim, he's going to strike through the heart of the king's enemies. That's what Zechariah 9 is about. So, who's he talking about here? If Judah is a reference to the Jews in the land, and this is about the second exodus of Israel, which really gets underway post-Armageddon, the sign of the Son of Man in heaven that causes the Jews to flee the lands of their dispersion, if that's what that's about, and it is, then the bow is purified Judah in the land, who no longer think that they are the Messiah. They've been humbled by the great earthquake, as it was in the days of Uzziah. And Christ looks at them and says, I want you, and you, and you, and you're going to go out with the saints, and you're going to tell your brethren who are coming back under Elijah what you've seen. You've seen the King of Israel, and you've seen the wounds in his hands. You've seen the foundations of the temple laid. You've seen the land divided into 13 sections. And you've been placed in your own part of that land. You go out and tell them what's happening. And what do you think that might do for the Jews returning under Elijah? It's a bit like the spies when they came back from the land. 2 only were faithful. The message was great things going on. All right? And that provides motivation. What do you use a bow for? To provide motivation for an arrow, don't you? You got a bow without an arrow? Not much good. You might be able to whack them over the head with it, but it's not much good. You got an arrow without a bow? Dart maybe? But not much good. You get a bow and you put an arrow in it, boom, like Jehu, straight through the heart of the enemy. So the motivation is provided by the Jews in the land who have been purified by Armageddon and the events that follow. The arrow is called Ephraim. Israel, Ephraim, and the remnant of Jacob, the Jews who are outside the land, returning to the under Elijah, will be brought to Europe. We'll see that in our next study, I think. Be brought to Europe, and their Catholic apostasy and rebellion against Christ's rule will be at its height, and they will strike through the heart of the enemy, guided by Elijah and the saints, who, as Zechariah 9:14 says, are seen over them like the cloud over Israel in the wilderness. And amongst that company will be some from Judah who go out to provide that motivation for their brethren to return to the land. It's a wonderful picture, brothers and sisters. It will shortly be a reality in the earth, and hopefully all of us will find a part in it.